Visakha, known as the City of Destiny, is spread on the coast of Bay of Bengal in Andhra Pradesh. Being an abode of natural beauty, this city attracts a large number of tourists and is developing by leaps and bounds. Andhra University, which gained national prominence with its unique style of offering higher education, is situated in this city.
Is it okay? Shall we start? Hello everyone, good evening. First of all, I wish you all a very happy new year, and I would like to thank everyone for joining this session and hope everyone makes use of it completely. As you all know, our previous workshop with Fahim sir, Keshav sir and Ardeep sir was successful and was very informative and productive. And now this is our second session with Shoan Shinde sir, the head of marketing and alliances of the Coinman Group. And without much delay, let us walk into the today's session. And to begin with, Hult is an international platform that crowdsources ideas from the students all over the globe to solve the present pressing social issue and also funds the winning team for the startup. And for the first time, our very own Andhra University is hosting Hult Prize. And on this note, we have to thank Professor Mallikarjun sir. Without him, we couldn't have come this far. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And now I would like to welcome the campus director Vineel Judson of Hult Andhra University to speak up. Over to you, Vineel.
Thank you, Maniratnam, for a wonderful introduction of the Hult Prize. As you all know, Hult Prize has been hosted by Andhra University, and the on-campus date will be announced very soon. And today's session will be taken by Shoan Shinde, who is a design thinking expert. And today's session will be an informative session to all the participants, and all your queries will be also be answered in the session itself. And I hope this session will be a great informative session. So please stay tuned to this session. And as you all know, we are very much nearer to our on-campus date, and on-campus date will be announced very soon. So please stay tuned through our social media platforms. And yeah, now. I will again hand over the screen to Maniratnam, and we can start the session.
Thank you, Vinil. And now it is my great honor to introduce our today's speaker, Shoan Shinde sir, who is the former student of Indian Business School, Hyderabad. He brings to the table an experience of 12 years in building brands and business, including his own creative agency and a family enterprise. He assists companies to develop strategies that align with their short and long-term goals. And now, on this note, I would like to welcome our guest and our keynote speaker, Shoan Shinde sir, to take up the session. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Maniratnam. Thanks, Vineel. I guess everyone can also see my screen as well. Okay, great. So very briefly about myself. So I have been practicing design thinking for nearly a decade and a half now. This goes back right to my engineering days. I moved from there to a bunch of other roles. I have been practicing designing independently Design thinking has been a way of life. I've been formally practicing it now as a consultant and all of it since the past decade now. And so let me take you all to today's session. Now, design thinking, the sheer nature of this topic by virtue of it requires it to be kind of more hands-on. So that's why we do a lot of workshops and all of, that's how we kind of take it in that format. Now, to be honest, this is the first time I'm doing a live streaming. So I'm hoping that as many people of you guys can, want to interact with it. Please direct it into the comment section, because typically I kind of call out people and they kind of interact with me through these sessions. So the comment section is open for this, right? So today we're going to be talking about, we'll cover a couple of topics. First of all, we'll start with this whole aspect of growth mindset versus fixed mindset, the need and relevance of it in the context of design thinking. We'll, of course, look at the design thinking process itself. From here, I want to take you guys through what I refer to as, consumer journey, given the fact that from the Hult Prizes context, the role that design thinking can play in the creation of innovative solutions. For that, we'll also be doing a bunch of application, scenarios and case studies, but a little more specific from a food context and especially from a social sector food context. Okay. So I'm going to start with talking about growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Now, typically, this is an area where I kind of open it up to the flow to get people to respond back. While I can't do that, I'm hoping that people can just drop in a bunch of comments into the section. So when we say growth mindset, and there's a reason why it's so important or intricate to the concept of design thinking to be able to apply design thinking. So think of this as a scenario, right? Very often in the work that we do, in new things that we're learning or challenges that we face, there are some people who respond to that kind of a situation from the tonality that, this is not what I have been taught. I have not been trained or equipped for this. And it's, not my scheme of things. So failure is something that they take as a roadblock, which they're really not looking forward to go beyond. Growth mindset, on the other hand, invokes this persistence in the practitioner, which is about where you take a challenge or a roadblock as an opportunity to learn and grow beyond that. So the reason why it's so integral to be able to practice design thinking, because it is about having a more expansive mindset. It's being able to learn when, or to in fact, to learn, to unlearn, and then learn more, to be able to have that broader sense of, how do you overcome challenges. And very importantly, what design thinking also does largely is it questions a lot of our preconceived notions. It challenges the norm, very often because it requires multiple stakeholders to kind of come together and brainstorm over situations. Very often than not, we are presented with an opinion or a perspective, which is something that we typically wouldn't otherwise agree with. So to look beyond all of that, to be open to the fact that there can and is another solution or opinion out there, and then relook at our own and take it forward from there. This is why having a growth mindset becomes so, as I said, it's very integral to design thinking. So let's look at design thinking in a little more detail now. Now, again, this is another part that I love to hear back from users on what does design thinking generally mean to people. Now, I have been conducting these kind of sessions for a while, and generally we kind of roll out surveys and to get a sense of how people already know the subject or how they perceive it. The thing that I want to talk about upfront, it's very important to understand that design thinking is not about visual design. It's not how it looks. Design thinking is, for a fact, how things function, right? A lot of people think of design thinking that, of course, in the last decade or so, and since the mid 90s, it became extremely popular. Of course, thanks to the virtue of, from Don Norman at Apple incorporating it extensively, someone who's referred to as the father of UX, because it's considered to be the founding stones of how Apple designed it as a brand, designed their products, all of that. Now, when it comes to design thinking in that sense, a lot of people associate it by default that when we talk about UX, UI, and design thinking, it's the same thing, or at least it's the most closely associated. To a large extent, it is marketing propaganda from a very successful company. from a factual context, the principles of design thinking took birth almost 4.5 decades before Don Norman made it popular, thanks to a Russian scientist who conducted and actually developed the theory when he was in prison. The theory is called TRIZ, and it actually has a lot more founding principles and checkpoints. It has over 100 checkpoints as opposed to the 4 or 5 that design thinking has. But as most things, given the context of the Cold War that followed and how America became extremely popular, design thinking became the norm. And then, of course, Silicon Valley happened, and the world acknowledged America as the forefront of technological innovation, and hence design thinking got attributed to a large extent with as something that took birth in America. Now, coming back to the topic of design thinking, as I said, it's not something that's very closely associated, or for that matter, restricted only to technological innovation or technical products. It's something that, for a fact, is in practice today by governments around the world, where they design and develop public policy using design thinking. You can actually use it for service design, where you can also re-question the use or development of a product. So typically people think of product in the sense of there is service offering and there is a product offering. Design thinking has helped companies imagine the whole aspect of where you can think of a product as a service. In this context, you can think of Uber. So this is where the expansiveness of design thinking actually comes to the fore, right? Now, taking 2 steps back, let's look at it from a simpler sense for people who have just heard of the terminology, or something that's kind of become a lot of jargon nowadays. A lot of people are actually talking about design thinking. A lot of schools are making it compulsory part of the curriculum for the students, and so on and so forth. But in its simplest sense, if one has to understand design thinking, it is nothing but what I would refer to as a problem-solving approach, right? More specifically, it's a user-centered problem-solving approach. Now, the user is key to how a problem manifests itself, and how, as someone who's developing a solution for it, you would think about solving for that problem. Without understanding who the user is, it's where the actual challenge lies. Now, the reason why design thinking became so popular in recent times and all of that is because, unlike the traditional method of where the more orthodox industries have practiced business, is where they have followed what we refer to as a waterfall effect, where product development, solution offerings, as they can went through the transitions of being developed and outsourced or marketed, they went through one stage after the other. Again, think of any typical business. Decisions were taken either at top promoter levels. As they subsequently went down through various departments, the product took shape. You would have a branding marketing team that would package the product and eventually get into distribution. Now, things always followed, as I said, a linear process. Now, design thinking is circular in that sense. It's something that is not linear. It doesn't go from one stage to the other. Now, as guys who come from either technical backgrounds or who relatively, given your generation, you all would understand that what it means to be agile, what it means when we talk about Scrum. So these are concepts or attributes which take birth in the idea of design thinking. So when I say it's not linear, typically industry recognizes design thinking as this process. It's circular in nature. There can be 3, 4, 5, 6 stages depending on where you're getting your information from. But largely, the idea of the process is still the same, where it starts with understanding a problem, defining a solution, and developing it and testing it out. Now, the reason where it becomes different, or the way it becomes different from a typical linear process, is that design thinking goes in iterations. So while you can go from identifying a problem, creating a solution, and testing it out, you would not stop there. You would take it back to your users, identify what is working, what's not working, and keep going in those loops. So if you had to rethink or reimagine this circular process of design thinking, and another way of looking at it would be to think of it in the context of a spiral. What it essentially means is that you start at one point and you repeatedly go through these iterations till you reach an end case scenario. Now, this end case scenario effectively is what I would refer to as where you're not developing an ideal solution, but it's about the best case or the best possible option that you can get out of it. For a fact, see, it's very important to understand that there is no ideal solution. In an ideal world, there would be no problem in the first place. Now, the fact that a problem exists, the question is, how do we create or ideate or develop a solution as an outcome which can satisfy the requirements of the majority of the stakeholders. So this is why design thinking works well, because it takes into account multiple users, right? So let's go to this bit where I mentioned that it's a user-centered approach, and it's key to understand the user before even understanding how to implement design thinking, because if you are unable to define the user correctly, it will always be very challenging on how do you actually identify the problem in the first place. So forget solving for it, right? So again, this is where we start talking about who is the user. And the challenge over here, again, this is typically a part of my session that I would really love to hear from people talking or telling me what they think is the user. But from all the multiple sessions that I've done, most people have understood the user to be a customer, someone who is paying for my service or product. Let's say, for example, I was talking about a toothbrush. If I was a business who was selling toothbrushes, who is my customer? The person who walks into a store and buys my toothbrush. It is important to understand that in most cases, very often, that a customer and a consumer is not necessarily the same person. A customer is effectively someone who is in the timeline of a person being a consumer, but not always the same, right? The simplest example to kind of think about this is K-12 education. Parents are customers, whereas children are consumers. So when you start questioning the definition of a consumer or a customer, you will realize that there is a broader nuance to who a user is. Now, what makes design thinking even more interesting is that unlike traditional business, which has always looked at the user as the demand side of the equation, design thinking also looks upon a user as someone who sits on the supply side. Now, what this means is when you have a problem and you're developing a solution for it, a user, according to design thinking, is every stakeholder who not only comes into contact with the problem or witnesses or faces the problem and its acquisition of a solution, but also the team and the people who are involved in the development of the solution, which in the case of a business or of a team who's actually developing an idea, and you guys, so you all actually become a part. You are also stakeholders, the people who support you, be it through resources. They are also stakeholders in solving for this equation. So the moment you start looking at the user in this broader sense, you realize that there are multiple more touch points that you have to address. And this is actually one of the reasons why design thinking has picked up a lot in recent times, right? Now, going back to this bit about this circular process, and as I said, a lot of information you will find off the internet will give you all a very good idea of what these 5-6 stages are. And while industry, to a large extent, as I said, accepts this as the definition, personally, I've been a bigger fan of Professor Jean from the Darden Business School, because she came up with a 4-question model, which is more realistic, which is more application oriented. And for someone like me who has actually been in the industry for so long, and this is what I do, we relate to her model because it's a lot more real case scenario. And so I'm not going to be actually talking about these 5-6 stages. I'm going to look at that 4-question model. Okay. It's a simpler process. It's easier to understand. It's more real world application oriented. So let's start with the first question. When you start with understanding a design thinking process, or actually applying a design thinking process, in the context of you guys who are going to be participating for the Hult Prize, I believe this year's competition is about food for good. So when you all start with the entire journey of developing a solution for this, either in the context very specifically for Hult, or eventually in the future as you guys go forward, if you all are to start up something on your own, be entrepreneurs, so on and so forth. I think this model generally will help you guys a lot, right? So when you start off, the first question that you'll really want to be talking about or understanding or trying to get an answer to is a what is question. A what is question in its simplest form questions or tries helps you question the scenario that results in a problem, right? Now what I mean when I say this is that think of any problem that you're trying to solve for. Now a problem typically doesn't occur or happen overnight. It is circumstances that have deteriorated with time. So when you think of the question the what you're hoping to achieve when you ask it from the scenario, from all the stakeholders that you have assimilated to the table, and you're having these back and forth brainstorming sessions, the what is question is about being able to understand what the real problem is. Now when I say real problem, see, different users will have varying degrees of problems. The stickier the problem or the more wicked the problem, as we refer to it in design thinking, the better the case to solve, because it actually results to, more often than not, situations aren't really complicated. The solutions are very simple, but when you start taking this approach, it puts forth onto the table a bunch of questions that otherwise don't get addressed. Again, more specifically in the context of the Hult prize and the good food for good, if we have to think of it in that sense, um, it's not just about making food accessible to people who can't reach it. It's also about where do you source food from. It's also about processing, storage, so on and so forth of the food. It also involves this entire financial consideration that comes into the picture, either from a donation perspective or the acquisition of resources to be able to effect your solution. So when you bring stakeholders and go back to the definition of design thinking of who is a user, all the stakeholders, when the what is question is put forth to all these stakeholders, you will get a better sense of understanding where their challenges are and what they are hoping for as a solution. Another consideration that happens because of design thinking and this process is that you're not only solving for what they think they need. So it's important to understand, see, there is a difference between needs, requirements, and expectations. So some things are expected of a solution. There are some things that are needed from the solution, and there are what we refer to as latent needs. Latent needs are typically those that will arise, that exist for the user without them explicitly knowing it. These are either triggered by other situations, and the only way really you can get inputs to all these questions that you would ask your users is by engaging through one-on-one discussions with them, through what we refer to in the world of design thinking is our feedback surveys, are all of that, right? If I have to leave you guys with one tool or one way to really how do you understand the real problem, it's empathy. And I mean, personally, I can say this, that I think empathy is probably one of the most undermined or undervalued attributes in today's world of business, because largely business has always been about companies or promoters knowing what is best for the customer. Very often than not, they aren't really solving for genuine pain points and problems. And those few businesses that came along and solved for those, we know where they have reached today, right? So when you talk about empathy, when you talk about how do you acquire your responses, as I said, feedback surveys, one-on-one discussions, focus groups, these are things that have been exercised extensively to be able to gather this kind of information. Now, from the context of the process, right, if you have to think of it as where do we stand now? If you're actually executing the process, you've gone through this entire journey of question number one, which is a what is. So you've got a bunch of questions sitting on the table that need to be answered. So the next obvious question, or the way you would approach it, is to try and develop a solution for your problems, the multiple problems that you have. Now, in that, what I would suggest to do, or as as Professor Jean says, what you would do is ask a what if question. A what if question is the reason it's a what if is because it starts with the presumption that everything in this world is possible. Now, it's important to understand this is not about an ideal solution, but it's about exploring all the possible solutions that you can to solve for those problems. Um, Another way to look at the same thing is what we refer to very commonly today, right? It's about thinking out of the box and coming up with innovative ideas. It's important to understand that design thinking is not about developing an innovative idea. It's not about that when you start using or implementing the DT process that oh, I will have an innovative idea at the end of it. Innovation is an outcome. The solution is an outcome. The process is very different from that, right? When you start off and actually start developing these solutions for the problems that you have on the table, if you start with the presumption that you can use any solution, not restricted by industry or business, you start thinking broader. Again, let's look at it from the perspective of traditional businesses. Traditional businesses have done things a certain way since the time of industrialization because that's how it has always been done. Think in context of today's SMEs or most family run businesses or operations. It's because this is how things have always been happening for the past 20, 30 years. This is how the industry does it, so therefore it is the right way to do it. Very often the innovation lies outside of your immediate zone. So when they say come out of your comfort zone, paint outside the boxes, it's largely that when you're going to explore for a solution outside of your immediate environment. So what I would then tell you all to do is start with the assumption that there is no box. Forget thinking outside the box. Think as if there were no box in the first place. So as an outcome of this now, or an exercise that typically in our world, again, something that has become extremely common, a loosely used term, in how do you get about coming up with these ideas is what we refer to as brainstorming, right? Now, the reason why brainstorming works in the context of DT more effectively than just one think tank sitting in some corporate office coming up with ideas, in the world of design thinking, you have involved all the users, you have involved all the stakeholders to the situation, and they are now a part of trying to develop the solution, right? Sorry. So they are people who are questioning all the possible, trying to develop all the possible solutions to the plethora of questions that you have on the table, ideating outside of the box, as I said, questioning that just because it exists a certain way doesn't mean that that is the right way. So when we move from here forward in the actual world of application of DT, this is where you start trying to filter out from the lots of solutions that you have is where the most value is getting created for your users. So a question that you would want to ask over here is a what wows. So a what wows is something that is sticky with your user, something that creates what we refer to as brand awareness, something that creates maximum value for your customers. So when you think of it in that context, what you're really looking for of all the solutions that you have identified, which of them is most valued by a customer, so that this value, what we refer to again terms as value addition or creating value for your customers, is not always only monetary. It's not only something that has saved them the most money, but something that can also be very intangible. So when you rethink the concept of value, it opens up a lot more doors, right? To be able to do this, the simplest way, and again, after empathy, I think probably the second most undervalued thing is where companies don't really talk to customers. So the way that you get about it in design thinking is that you would maintain those focus groups, you would maintain those feedbacks, those loops, so that you are continuously getting iterative feedback on it. Now think in the context of all the innovation or product solutions or offerings or services that have been developed, or public policies for that matter, where they are rolled out in small installments, and changes that happen are done on an incremental way. It stems from the belief of failing small and failing fast, as opposed to trying to develop one perfect solution, right? So which actually brings us now to the fourth part of this journey of trying to figure out which of these solutions work is because from here you're going to the area of trying to see which of the solutions can actually be implemented, which are viable, feasible, from the business's context of actually developing them, as well as from the context of a consumer acquiring them. So any product that you want to think of it in this context is that while a business has to think of where do the resources come from, where do raw materials come from, how does it put them together, the R&D required for it, can the distribution channels existing work, so on and so forth. At the same time, from the customer's perspective of how easily can he or she acquire the solution. So what you're trying to achieve from this particular stage is to see how workable those wonderful solutions are that have created maximum value. So to do this, and this is something again where most businesses traditionally have tried to create an entire product and take it to the shelves, as opposed to what we would do is prototype it. Now, prototyping is important to understand. Again, a relatively incorrectly understood term. People think of prototype as a bare basic version of things. That's an MVP, a minimum viable product. A prototype, on the other hand, is something that requires that is rolled out to the customer in whatever shape or form it is. It doesn't really need to be a physical product. It can be a paper-based plan. It can be literally sitting across with your test users and explaining to them the various stages of what your solution and offering would be, what inputs would be required from them, how would you respond back as the offering, and all of that. Now, this is an area where I do get a lot of questions typically on we don't have the budget, especially when it comes to students trying to develop a solution, say in the context of the Hult Prize, that in today's time of COVID, we really can't go out there and get feedback. We can't have in-person discussions. We don't have the budget to really execute it out of pocket. If you understand the implementation of design thinking in its simplest way, you would realize that you don't really need to be going out there having in-person physical discussions. I understand it would have been an ideal scenario if you could, but given COVID, it makes sense to kind of do these things virtually, as long as you can create a representative sample size of your target audience. It works. So instead of having a huge vast survey of 5,000 odd people, create a small focus group of 10, 15 people, but where you can derive maximum inputs from. So instead of treating it as a sample size of your population, what you would do is make it a focus group, right? And when it comes to prototyping, again, you don't have to have a complete solution that requires money. It can actually be a paper plan of the solutions. You can be hand-drawn things on paper. You can create an entire workflow using a bunch of free softwares on the internet. As long as you can take your prospective customers or consumers through this journey to be able to understand how you're trying to solve the problem. So these 4 questions, one of the reasons that I said, I personally am a bigger advocate of these as opposed to the traditional 5-6 model, is because this is simpler in that sense to understand, to implement, is more real world, right? So the what is, a what if, what wows and what works, these is a simpler model that is more realistic in that context, right? Now, typically, this is an area where I throw it open for questions. I don't know if there's anything in the comments. So if Mani Ratnam or any of them could kind of plug in over here, that would help before I move to the next section. Mani Ratnam, are you here? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to continue from here. The next part that we talk about, right, what we refer to as customer experience. Now, sorry, business has typically known this process as a customer's journey, a customer's experience, something that the customer, how he or she goes through this typical funnel of 5 stages of awareness and consideration and acquisition and so on and so forth. Personally, I like to think of it in the context of um, as a consumer's experience rather than a customer's experience. So, as I mentioned earlier, customer is somewhere along the timeline of a person being a consumer. So, again, let's look at the really super simple example of a toothbrush, right? um, as I said, the manifestation of a problem happens with time. It's not that one fine day you wake up and say, "Oh, I want to buy a new toothbrush." You walk into a store and buy it. Typically, your solution that you are using presently will deteriorate it. The condition will escalate to a point that you feel that, okay, this is not working for me. I need another toothbrush. That is the stage where you will go to a shop. You will probably be influenced through various advertisements, either be open to trying out something new, or you are super high on brand loyalty. You will then go to the store, acquire the product, come back and consume it. It's just that very small part of this entire journey where you're in that store making that purchase that you are a customer. The rest of the time you are a consumer. And when I say consumer, you're not just the consumer of their product, but you are consumer of a much broader sense of things, of the entire advertising campaign, the brand positioning, the solution, the post service sales, and all of that. If you think of a more complicated product, think of an automobile. You do not walk into a store and just buy a car. There is an entire consideration cycle which is much larger. The influence of branding and marketing on in that context is also much larger. After sales plays a very big part in the world of owning and maintaining an automobile. So when you start looking at the much larger perspective, you realize that there's a longer timeline of your prospects being consumers. Now, as businesses, if you can understand this journey that your consumer is on, and as a business, or any as a solution provider for that matter, the touch points that you can have with your consumer, you can develop very effective solutions. Now, when I say solutions, it's not only the final product or the final service. It involves everything from making your consumer more aware, to getting their buy-in, to getting them to experience your product, to consume your product, to become a potential customer co-creator in an after-sales world. So this larger loop is, if a business has a better sense or understanding of this consumer journey, there is a lot more impact that they can have in that sense. Now, for a business to be able to effect this in a much better manner, what it needs to do is look into itself as to what it has that it can bring to the table. So one of the things, for example, is what we refer to as props. There are the 3 Ps of business. There is props, which are essentially the physical or digital assets that a company owns. This can be, as I said, the offering itself, the solution, including correspondence, including advertisements, everything that the company can use to make contact or communication with a potential consumer, influence them, onboard them, and provide them an experience. So props are that entire bucket of these assets. Now, once you have props, it requires your next resource, which is extremely important, to be able to deliver it as an experience to your users, what we refer to as people. An organization or a business is not about profit, definitely not profit. It's not about numbers, it's not about your business model. Businesses and organizations are about people. The better the people on board to implement or effect your offering or your solution to your consumers, the higher and the richer is the experience for them, which basically means there's better buy-in. Now, people are all those stakeholders, again, your users, who come directly or indirectly in contact with the service and how they can influence this decision of your consumers. And for a fact, in every business, no matter how great your products or your people, it requires that things get standardized to the extent that the experience gets standardized, which basically means that as a business, you need processes. Processes are basically those things or procedures which ensure that even if resources change with time, if a product undergoes an evolution or if one person is removed from the system and another is plugged in, it still continues functioning like a well-oiled machine. And that's the much larger sense of understanding, processes. So as a business, as from the entire concept of consumer journey, for a business to be able to provide or create that kind of impact for its users, it's these three P's that it kind of brings to the fore and thinks of it in the context of implementation, right? Now, very important before we move to the next part is to understand that design thinking is not a one size fits all. And to be honest, this is actually what makes it interesting, because business to business, it can adapt itself, be it a product, tech, non-tech, anything, right? It's not just even about business. It's about, as long as you have a problem and you have to identify or develop a solution to solve it, it can be used, as long as there are certain guidelines or guardrails that we consider in the world of design thinking that you can work towards and develop that kind of a solution, right? So when you think of it in that sense, you will realize that there's a much broader spectrum to which design thinking can be applied. In today, when we're going to look at two cases very specifically in the context of food, the first is the story of the good kitchen. Now, this goes back to the year 2000, mid 2000s, and it's from a small town called Holstebro in Denmark. So it's a little context and background to this story. Okay. In this town, as part of the Hygge culture of Denmark, taking care of loved ones, taking care of the elderly, of retired folks, is a very big part of their culture, which it means that people, what we refer to as retirement homes, right? People who have retired, who do not have family or support for them, are looked after by the municipal corporation, by the state. A part of that is ensuring that they have their regular meals provided to them. Now, back in the time when the case occurred, the state was facing this challenge where the elderly, the people who they were serving these meals to, were not consuming their meals. And to solve for this, they thought, but obviously, I mean, the logic is this, right? If you go home today and you see certain dishes prepared and put on the table which you don't like, the assumption was that you will not eat it. And that's exactly what the municipal corporation also assumed, when that the reason the old people or the elderly are not eating the food is because they didn't like what was being prepared. So they called in an agency. It was another Danish agency to redesign their menu, where they thought if they had better dishes and nicer food on the menu, the people would eat. To do that, now, thankfully, the agency didn't really typically go about that as a solution. They actually implemented a design thinking process. As an outcome of that, now, first of all, to effect that, they went out, they had a bunch of conversations with the elderly themselves, with the delivery people, with the people who were preparing the food, with the stakeholders at the municipal corporation as well, to understand why they want to implement this policy and what's the whole purpose of it. Now, depending on each of the various people that it spoke to, it realized that from the context of the people preparing the food, the challenge was that they were not creating. So in their world, in Denmark, people who actually created these meals, developed these meals, made these meals, they were not. They were not people who were they were kind of looked down upon by society, is because that you'd have no other job or function. There's nothing else that you're doing in your life. That's the reason you're just making these meals sitting at home. So there was a certain social taboo associated with the people who are actually preparing these meals. Second, when it came to the delivery people, these guys only prepared meals and put them out there without any context of service or experience as part of what they did. Of course, the municipal corporation had the agenda, because, as I said, it wasn't just about that it existed on paper and it was a budget allocated to it, but it, in a much deeper sense of things, it was part of as the Hygge culture, and something that's very deep rooted in Danish society. Now, from the context of the elderly, This was, I think, and as the agency admitted in their findings, was the most interesting of all their observations. The assumption made by the municipal corporation that the elderly were not eating their meals because they didn't like the food was completely was an absolute fallacy. And the reason for this is that when they spoke to the elderly, they found out that the meals were not being consumed because it reminded them that they were alone. They had to sit and eat their meals by themselves, which made them feel bad about their lives, which made them feel bad about the fact that they were either abandoned by their families, or that they didn't have families around them, or they were sitting all alone in their rooms and having these meals. And it was because of this that they didn't want to eat. So the reason of them not eating was emotional in nature, as opposed to something that was I don't like the food. Now, this is a much more difficult problem to solve. How do you solve for someone's emotional needs? So yes, the agency went through multiple cycles of how do we recreate this experience. The most obvious thing that they did try out was, can we recreate? Oh, think of in the context, we brought together a couple of models, right? One of these models was, when we think about eating good food, it's about recreating or the experience or the ambience of a restaurant. Now, it's not possible, yes, to create the ambience of a restaurant consistently for every single person's house, but there are finer nuances of a restaurant that can be incorporated. So that's what they did. It was the development of a menu, or the experience of being able to talk to, if you like the food, how you could actually go back or send your compliments to the chef. These are things that they incorporated by the use of small little post-it notes or sticky notes that kind of went back and forth with the meals that were being sent to them. The second thing, when it comes to the people who were actually preparing the meals, the social taboo that was associated with it, the way the agency got rid of it was by onboarding some of the most prestigious restaurants from that city and the neighboring cities to be a part of this program. Now, because of the virtue of that, everyone who was associated with the program suddenly, the prestige of being a part of it got transferred to them as well. Now they were not looked down upon as, as unemployed people who were cooking their food, but as experienced chefs who were making special dishes for their customers. They took it one step further. They actually developed what they refer to as open kitchens, where people could create this entire environment, watch them prepare their food, and actually be a experience this entire journey. When it comes to the elderly, this is where they actually solved it in the most interesting manner. They first, of course, did try to upskill and train their delivery people to create a more homely environment for them when they were actually delivering the food. It wasn't sustainable for multiple reasons. That the delivery people kind of it didn't work because they were youngsters who were either doing them as side jobs, post from university or college, or they were not really inclined or did not understand. There was no empathy on their part of why they should make that emotional connect with the elderly. So the agency took a completely different approach. It reached out to people who were otherwise retired from work, who could take on a side part-time job. So what happened is that there were just about retired people, but not so old that they could not fend for themselves, who actually became a part of this delivery and supply chain. So when they went to the elderly and gave these meals to them, they actually had conversations about their families, about what they watched on TV last night, and all of that to create. And they sat with them, they served them at the table, they sat with them and had these conversations because they didn't have anywhere else to go. So the amount of time that they could dedicate to the elderly exponentially increased, and the experience, the emotional hurdle that existed over there was overcome by a completely different approach that, again, like I said, most typically you would not really think of that as even the problem in the first place. Forget solving it in this manner. So here are a couple of pictures about what actually happened. They of course went through an entire rebranding exercise where they did packaged food. They created this entire thing about what's in your meal, how do you benefit from it, These are pictures of the restaurants where they created these wonderful open kitchens. And as I said, there were chefs who were preparing these dishes. Each meal had nutritional value associated with it, so that the people knew what they were eating. They could, and as I said, when the packaging went back to them, they could send little post-it notes and sticky notes about thanking the chef for the meal. And the chefs actually asked them, what would you like to eat in the coming week, and take requests from them to recreate that entire restaurant ambiance. These were, as I said, various meal courses. They were given menus of sorts that they could pick from. These are the people, I think it hasn't loaded yet. Yeah, sorry. These are the people who, as I said, the retired people who were actually doing the deliveries. It wasn't youngsters from college anymore, but people who had just about retired from work, or homemakers who could, aside from earning a little money on the side, become a part of this much bigger cultural system that exists in Denmark. So on multiple fronts, this addressed the much bigger pain point. So before I go to my next case, I believe there is a comment in the section. I'm just going to switch to that. Okay. So AS Raju has to ask, yeah, considering the Hult price, it is the students who play a major role. True. How do you understand the perspective of your customers? So one is definitely, so Raju, I'm hoping you're still listening. One of the things that you would want to do is to start with creating like a focus group. First, prior to that, understanding who are your users. Is it only the people who you are supplying the food to who are actually going to consume the food? Does it also involve from where you will procure the food? People who will make contributions to your cause, either, as I said, lenders, donors, people who have surplus food, so on and so forth. Once you are able to identify, based on whatever your business model is, who are the possible stakeholders, demand side, as in the customer consumption side of things, as well as the supply side. Supply side is basically the business side of things. And all the possible stakeholders that can get involved with the equation. You can filter out and discard them with time. You can wean through these various pain points to identify which are the more critical ones that you want to solve for. Because see, everyone has problems. It's about being able to understand whose problems merit being solved first or with more attention. Not to say that other problems are not important. It's only about creating, because as someone who's developing the solution, you too need a hierarchy of sorts. And the only way really that you can get about that is by being able to create this filtering system of, through the problems. So once you start with this perspective is of to understand who are your customers, is to take one step back and see all the possible stakeholders, the pain points that exist, the solutions that can take shape. I'm not saying that eventually take shape. I'm saying that they can take shape. And how do you solve for those pain points? Of your consumption side, some will be able to have affordability, that as in who will be able to pay for your solution, and there will be some who will not be able to pay for your solution. For the people who can pay for your solution, and those are the customers, it's easier to solve their problem, because here the business's interests get very quickly aligned with this. For customers who are unable, or affordability is a challenge for them, over here what happens is you will need to figure out alternate ways to still be able to supply a solution for them, especially given this context of the Hult price and the social aspect of all of it. It makes your problem slightly more complicated, because as I said, an alternate source per se is going to be required for you to be able to generate enough output for these customers, right? The non-paying customers. So I don't know to what extent this has answered your question, but if you have a follow-up, please direct it into the chat box. Okay, so Soma has asked an interesting question about overall, what is my idea of the theme, food for good? Okay, I'm going to answer this question actually using the next case study, because I think it's super relevant. If Somaya, your question doesn't get answered still, please feel free to hit me with one more. Yeah. Okay. So going to the Rockefeller Foundation. Some of you all may or may not have heard of this as a question, as an of the Rockefeller Foundation. It's one of the most leading prestigious institutions in the world who do a lot of work across various spectrums. One of the spectrums is food. Now, when they started off this entire exercise of how do they reduce food wastage, this was the very basic pain point that they were trying to solve. So, the United States, if I remember correctly, the time that they undertook this exercise, which was around 2010 or 11, at that point had annual food wastage, which was around 3 trillion tons. Um, it was enough to feed a developing country or certain African countries for up to 5 years. The amount of food that was wasted alone in the United States in a single year. So this exponential wastage of food is something that Rockefeller Foundation wanted to solve for. They onboarded the agency IDEO, and what they did in this process, IDEO brought all the possible stakeholders to the table. Everyone who was responsible for the food wastage, as well as people who could, or social or non-profit organizations, social organizations who could help dissipate the wasted food, right? Which means now it was a redefinition of how do you think what is food wastage. Is it prepared food, is it unprepared food, is it unprocessed food, or processed food and canned food? So food itself existed in these various forms. It's not just about, oh, there is a big buffet that has been created and lots of very interesting meals have been made and not everyone is eating and that's thrown into the dustbin. That is a form of food wastage. A lot of food gets wasted in transit when it has come from field to retail store. A lot of food gets wasted sitting in our fridges at home, or even in our shelves, which are with very high expiry dates, which are pumped with inert gases for longer shelf lives, but they still reach expiry very soon, either in our houses or in warehouses. So, like I said, food wastage had multiple touch points. And to address all of this, IDEO brought all of them to the table and they tried to brainstorm ways that they can solve for this. Funnily, they also thought of food wastage in the context of the packaging that goes into processed foods is a different form of wastage arising out of food. So it's not the food itself that is getting wasted, but overall the contribution to landfills and harm to the environment because of packaged food. So like I said, the moment you start broadening your understanding of the problem itself, you'll realize that there are so many more things that can develop out of it. So not just what was binned, they did these fantastic, really extensive exercises. The process, I think, went on for nearly 2.5 years in total. And as an outcome of this, they developed multiple solutions. So let's look at one of the first things that they came up with. One very obvious thing that they identified was food that was prepared or processed, more than prepared, that was processed, but had high shelf life. Think of canned food, packaged food, biscuits, wafers, so on and so forth. And all of this is was either lost, was wasted through warehousing, as in they reach their expiry dates, or in people's shelves because people love to hoard and save for a rainy day. In the United States, this is extremely dominant as a practice. So there were these huge copious amounts of food that were very near expiry date, hadn't still expired. So they created what today are known as food banks. So if you had food sitting at home, or restaurants or warehouses had a surplus of this food, instead of binning it or it ending up in the landfill, what happened is they created these banks that people could just go and deposit them. So they were, mind you, they were not expired foods. They were just prior to expiry, which means that they could still be consumed provided in a very short time period, which led to the second stage of this entire journey of trying to solve the problem, is what they created is became extremely popular around the world, called soup kitchens. It's an ideal scenario. Yes, you want to provide food, and this goes back to what I was briefly mentioning to Raju's question, is that, say I have food sitting on the table, that I want to provide to the lesser privileged sections of society. But where does that food come from? Where do I source the raw material to prepare the food and therefore sell it, distribute it? Food kitchens, these soup kitchens, sourced their raw material, the uncooked or unprocessed whatever food, from food banks. So it kind of became a part of the much larger value chain where canned or processed foods, which were stored in these containers, were brought to soup kitchens so that they could prepare them into meals and distribute them for free. Because, as I said, I mean, if a soup kitchen had to stand alone by itself, who is going to give them the money or the resources, be it food or whatever, to be able to prepare them and actually distribute them further to the lesser privileged? So, food kitchens became a very good, one step further into the pipeline of the value chain. Another very interesting thing was about people. They couldn't really only bank on soup kitchens, because it required people to go into the kitchen, prepare their meals. There were a lot of people retired sitting at home who wanted to still contribute in their small little way. Okay, you cannot probably feed 100 people, but I'm okay with feeding 5 people. Take that number multiplied by 100. So next thing you know, you're feeding 500 people. There were businesses that were born out of this as aggregators of such kind of home chefs who were willing to prepare these meals and distribute them for free. They capitalized on their business model, and this is something that might be of interest to a lot of you guys. Is there are in fact some aggregators who tried home kitchens or home chefs to sell through their platforms. Very similar to or along the lines of what was actually implemented through the Rockefellers initiative, where they onboarded these home chefs who cooked pro bono. They were anyway preparing a meal for them or their family, so they prepared for 3 or 4 more people. The resources or the food required, the raw material required to prepare these meals, came from the food kitchens, from these food banks. So it's not that I was spending extra effort or money in which I would donate to an agency or an NGO. I could actually create or make the food myself at home and have that feel good factor. So empathy, emotional attributes of people being associated with a social cause are very important things. So being able to tap into that is very critical. Another very interesting thing was there's this agency, a firm, a startup based out of it's today extremely well funded. They answered for the packaging part of the entire equation. Packaging, as I said, most of this plastic or metal cans or tins or styrofoam cases, containers in which food was packaged and given out, all of this ended up in the landfill. Aside from the food that gets wasted, like food, the United States again contributes extensively to the amount of dump that happens in the landfills with things that are not biodegradable. This startup had a bunch of patents that rolled out, won those patents because they took wasted food and they managed to create packaging out of it. They created a form of polyethylene, a form of plastic, because it's form of carbon at the end of it. They managed to create a form of plastic and packaging which was created out of food wastage itself, and therefore by the virtue of that became biodegradable. So it was a beautiful completion of this entire value chain, where it was the sourcing of it. It became the context of creating an offering or a distribution, as well as the packaging, so that it did not end up in the landfill at some point or the other. One other very interesting outcome of this was completely unexpected to a large extent. A lot of you must have been or seen these buffets that happen at big restaurants or parties and so on and so forth. You will see especially the dessert section or the appetizer section, things are served now in small portions. You will have a small piece of cake or pastry. Everything is served as a single offering. Of these entire discussions that happened as part of the Rockefellers initiative, it was the Hyatt that actually, the hotel group, that came up with this idea that they actually tested this out on one table where they had the dessert section. They put a full cake, and right next to it, they served the cake cut up into small pieces, just to see who would consume what and how much. People who cut big slices out of the cake for themselves almost never finish the big slice, whereas everyone who picked up a small serving obviously finished it, which goes to this very basic psychological behavior of, as a species, is that when it is there in front of us, the need for of consuming an extensive amount of it is very high. So with time, this became a standard for a lot of restaurants or hotels who were offering buffets, because they did save a lot of money inevitably, and definitely the huge amount of contribution to saving of food wastage. So the next time you'll go into these buffets and you'll see these small little servings of food, you'll know where it actually stemmed from. It was trying to solve for a much bigger problem of food wastage in the United States. And this is where Hyatt actually came up with this as an idea. So before I move to this next part, I've got a bunch of questions in the chat, so I'm going to take those. So Reshma has asked a couple. I am going to address them now. So Reshma says also, even if you are good as chances for the idea of business to be rejected or disliked by the government. Okay. Let me ask you the question. Are you creating your idea or solution to be endorsed by the government, or is it to solve for a genuine pain point? Who is the user that matters more to you? Yes, getting endorsement or support, financial or otherwise, from a local authority, the government, is obviously a good thing. But if you are truly starting a social cause, an enterprise or a venture to solve for a much larger social, eco-political, eco-social problem, endorsement from a government or regulating authority should not be your priority. How well the solution solves for the genuine pain points of your the group, the target segment you're hoping to solve for, to help, and how well you can dissipate that into that system, into society, that what I would say should be your priority. Another one from Reshma, I'm going to address that before I go to Rakshana's questions. Could I talk about the most commonly faced threats of our ideas and how to overcome them? The most commonly faced threat of your idea is yourself, without exaggeration. It's a curse of entrepreneurs, and there's a reason why 95% of the ideas in this world failed, or entrepreneurs or startup ventures fail, is because entrepreneurs become their own hurdles. When I say this, so I don't mean it from an operational or execution point of view or a business side of things. It's purely it's actually from a very psychological constraint. As human beings, once you are obsessed with an idea, when you have an idea, you get excessively obsessed with it. It is the right and the best and the perfect solution to everything in the world. So no matter how many opposing thoughts or opinions come your way, you're inclined to disregard them or identify or come up with reasons of your own to justify or validate your own ideas, to disregard the others. So if you now go back, and I don't know, Reshma, you were here or not, earlier on in this entire session, I spoke about growth mindset. And that's exactly what it means, is to be able to accept the fact that there are other opinions and to overcome your own challenges or hurdles. So for a fact, I think the bigger problem, more often than not, is that we are become our own roadblocks in the development of, or iterative development of, an idea. Rakshana's question in the theme of this, you don't have to solve for a particular problem. So I'm going to look at both your questions together because I think they're related. Can you suggest the focus point which you can go? Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to first address the first part. Should you solve for a problem, a particular problem or issue? This goes back slightly to what I was saying earlier, that see, everyone has problems. There are varying degrees of problems, right? All your multiple stakeholders will have different problems. As you go through these, there are some that merit more attention than the others. And how you filter through these will help you identify which are more important than the other ones. So that's how you want to think about if you should be focusing on one problem or multiple problems, A. B, the other way to think about it is also from the context of, in a slightly broader sense, that if you look back at this, the same Rockefeller example, there can be multiple parts to a value chain, like the food bank to the food kitchens to the home chefs, as well as the packaging guy. So there are multiple touch points in the same value chain or the same problem that is being trying to solve. So when you are ideating or developing the solution, it's possible that you don't end up with just one offering, but you end up with two or three complementary offerings, which is absolutely fine. And you can end up actually solving for just while there is one big umbrella of a problem that you're trying to solve for, there might be smaller considerations that that you can actually, other smaller target groups that you can address in the process. And that's why having that is important. Reshma's follow up to, yes, you do need permissions or licenses from the government, but that is irrelevant to your business idea. Those are more administrative in nature, as long as you meet certain requirements, compliances, etc. And this is slightly digressing from the main topic. Any company secretarial person who has studied the subject, who understands compliance and regulatory matters of filing or incorporation of an entity, will help you get those government approvals. This is unrelated to how great or bad or good or whatever your idea is, or the efficacy with which it is solving the problem. In this context, the government's acknowledgement or sanctioning and approval is irrelevant. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go back to a couple of slides because we've got 10 odd minutes left on this. Yeah. Now, everything that I said to design thinking, a lot of it must have sounded gibberish. A lot of it must have sounded very faffy and fluffy, and that this is just common sense. We have problems, we have solutions. You brainstorm, ideate, come up with blah blah. They sound super simple, and I will admit to you, it is extremely simple. Design thinking in its sheer nature of everything is very easy to comprehend, to be able to take into that kind of consideration. Where design thinking becomes difficult and where companies fail to truly apply it, they think they are applying it, or they would like to believe that they are applying it, but can't, is actually in its implementation phase. Now, the reason why I say this is design thinking in its sheer nature requires you to bring together different people. When I say bring together multiple stakeholders, it is bringing together demand side, supply side. Within each of these sides of the equation, it's bringing together different stakeholders, and people have different problems. When you bring all these guys to the table and you start thinking about it, you will assuredly get conflicting opinions. And as we are as a species, it is not easy to disregard our own ideas and thoughts and say that, okay, I am wrong and the other person is right. Maybe you'll do it once, maybe you'll do it twice, but it's very difficult to do it consistently. And design thinking is very specifically in that sense requires opposites, right? You have the business of everything and the art of everything. It's to kind of create this magical balance of all of it and force opposites to get into bed together and come up and create something beautiful and new. And that's exactly where it becomes a challenge, the implementation of design thinking. So, this is the quote by Peter Drucker, a very famous marketer who said this, a business guru, is that see, culture of an organization is something, or any team, culture is something that you do repeatedly. You do it 10 times, 20 times, and the 21st time, it is referred to as culture of that organization. It's how people think and behave consistently, repeatedly, over and over again. Now, you could have the bestest of ideas. You could have the most innovative people, great talent on board. But if there is no sync, if the culture of an organization is not deep rooted and that instills growth mindset into how its people are, these best of processes in the world will fail. So something that I repeatedly say, I don't know if I mentioned this in the beginning, design thinking is a mindset. It's just that, it's nothing else. It's how you want to have problems, think about problems, so on and so forth. So pretty much this is it about design thinking from me. I'm going to move to a few questions that I left. You're most welcome, Reshma. Um, so Soma's last question. Yes and no. So Soma's question is that given how competitive everything is today across fields, starting a new business has become difficult, especially to sustain competition. Um, like I said, yes and no. Just because you can't come up with see, it's not always about innovating and reinventing the wheel, right? No one has to discover fire. Um, there is a Instead of thinking about trying to grab the largest slice of the pie, it's about being able to think how can you make the pie bigger. It's being able to understand how you can collaborate and work with other people to increase your share of everything, right? Now, as random as that might sound, um, irrespective of how competitive businesses are today, that has always been the case. Businesses have always been competitive. It's in their nature to be competitive. No business, see, businesses are in the business of business, so they will always be inherently competitive. Um, just because you want to start something new, you do not have to start the next biggest conglomerate of the world. As long you can either a target a niche audience, or b you could create an offering that caters to that large giant of a company. There is always a market space for a new offering, or a better offering, or an evolved offering. So it's just a matter of perspective, right? About where do you see yourself. So starting a business is one thing. Making it sustain and survive for the first 3 years is actually the bigger challenge. It really doesn't take time to, I have an idea, I want to start up. It's not difficult. um, but what then, what next, what after that? And this iterative process, and one of the reasons when I said, design thinking is a mindset, it's how well you can consistently go or accept failure, learn from it, and take a step forward. This is essentially largely what we're talking about. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it from me. If there are any more questions, please feel free to direct them to the chat. I'm going to ask Mani Ratnam or Vineel. I don't think Vineel's here. So either Soma or Mani Ratnam to kind of step in here now.
Yes, sir. I think the questionnaire is completed and there are no more questions right now. And
Okay,
it is it, sir. It is it. And we can conclude the session now.
perfect. Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, whoever was here. Thanks, Mani Ratnam. Thanks, Soma. Please do convey my thank you to Vineel as well. It was
Yes,
wonderful
sir.
talking to you guys.
It is our pleasure, sir. First of all, I thank you for joining us today. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. It was really very productive session. It really helps all our participants a lot. And the way you started the session with differentiating growth mindset and fixed mindset, and then about design thinking, its virtue and how it works, it is really informative, sir. And also the way you explained by bringing up the examples of Good Kitchen, Rockefeller Foundation, made us easy to understand. Thank you, sir. Thank you for all of that. And thank you so much for clearing all the doubts of all the participants. And finally, I can say that it helped all the participants a lot. And thank you for the session.
My pleasure. And thank you. Welcome to everyone who's thanking me in the chats. Thank you. Wish you guys all the best to the competition.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And on this note, I thank all the participants and all the viewers who joined this session. It would have not been possible if all our team couldn't have put effort in this session. And I thank Vinil and all our team coordinators for making this event possible. And thank you for joining us today. And again, and small, I want to thank campus director Vinil, Somaraju, and Bhavita for making this session happen. And also to all the participants, I would like to say one thing, that is the date of Hult Prize will be announced soon and of the on-campus event. And be prepared for it and all the best. Thank you, guys. And
Thank you, everyone who attended this event. Okay, thank you for taking time out of your life in attending this kind of session. And if you still have any kind of doubts as such, you can text me through WhatsApp. I'll be available, totally available on the social media. If you want to interact with the Shoan Shinde sir, you can connect your LinkedIn profile with him, so that you can text him through the LinkedIn chat box. So that's it.
Okay, thank you, Somraj. So we can finish the session, or we can
Yeah,
end the
yeah,
session.
yeah. Yeah, you can leave the studio. Yes. Thank you, man. Bye.